Hello and welcome to the Alex Waters Show. And today's episode, I've got with me Dr. Stephen Bright. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Stephen is a psychologist, ethnopharmacologist, founding member and vice president of PRISM, which is a not-for-profit organization that aims to fund positive alcohol and other drug research, and is also a senior lecturer of addiction at Edith Cowan University in Perth. First question I have for you is actually, what's the difference between a doctor and a professor? How do you get that title?
So a doctor means that you have a PhD,
Yeah.
or if you're a medical doctor in Australia, technically the award of being, the status of being doctor is something that is given to them when they graduate. They don't actually have a doctorate per se.
Yeah.
I used to work as a manager of an AOD service, and the addiction medicine specialist there that was a medical doctor when I got my PhD said, now we've got a real doctor, because in fact they don't do a doctorate when you do medicine.
Right.
And then the difference between doctor and professor is just promotion, basically. So it goes lecturer, senior lecturer, associate professor, professor.
Okay. Right. So maybe one day soon then.
one day possibly.
Yeah. When I was preparing, I just kept mixing up. I'm like, is he a professor or a doctor? Because I just assumed, most lecturers were called a professor of some kind. So there you go. So we're here to talk about, a lot about psychedelics and the research that's happening at the moment, which is obviously a big part of your work. How did you get into this field of work and sort of doing what you do now? And maybe if you describe what you do now.
Well, I got into psychology because at 22, I wasn't sort of happy with the job I had and was looking for a change. And I was interested in working with people experiencing problems with alcohol and other drugs, because I'd experienced some of that in my personal life. And so I grew up in Geraldton, moved down to Perth to study, and then I went on to do a master's in clinical psychology, PhD. And while I was doing my PhD, I had the opportunity to start teaching addiction studies at Curtin University. They had some units there. And basically, I moved to Melbourne because my PhD scholarship ran out. I was doing some contract work with a company as a psychologist. And I said to them, look, I need a full-time job. I might be shooting myself in the foot here, but either, if you've got something, I would be open to taking it. And they offered me a job in Melbourne. So I packed up the car and drove to Melbourne. And from there, just sort of fell from job to job. So I worked spent most of my time in Melbourne working for Peninsula Health, which operates Frankston Hospital, Rosebud Hospital, and 4 community health sites. And worked my way up to being the manager of the alcohol and other drug treatment services, which was something I aspired to.
Yeah.
And then I got there and realised I didn't actually want to do that,
Right.
because the middle management just involves signing lots of things, having meetings about meetings about meetings, and it was just really not what I thought it was going to be. And then transitioned out into a senior psychologist role at Monash Health, and then quite out of the blue, one of my old lecturers at ECU called me and said, have you thought about full-time academia? We've got a job going here in Perth. So in 2017, packed up the car again and drove back over the Nullarbor and came back to Perth. And so my current role is a split between a little bit of clinical work, a bit of teaching work. So I teach a course. It's called Addiction Studies, but it's a bit of a misnomer because we don't really talk about addiction that much. It's more ethnopharmacology. It's human relationship with drugs, behaviour change, not just for addiction, but for all behaviour. And we train students up in how to do basic counselling skills and also understanding policy. So we've set up, since I've been at ECU, the students there have set up a chapter for Students for Sensible Drug Policy to advocate towards more sensible drug policy here in Australia, both for psychedelics, but also things like pill testing.
Mm-hmm.
And then a research element as well. So I've got sort of my own research program, which I've developed. Or even as I was working as a psychologist, I've always been doing a bit of research and teaching on the side. Whereas now that's part of my sort of paid work. Whereas in the past, it was a hobby horse of mine, doing a bit of research, where now it's sort of 40% of my role.
Yeah, amazing. And I mean, a lot of people listening probably actually don't know about what research is happening around Australia in terms of, particularly in terms of clinical use of, substances like MDMA and psilocybin. Can you tell us about what's happening at the moment in Australia?
Yeah, so in addition to the clinical research, so a lot of the research that I'm doing at the moment involves supervising research students, so honours, masters, PhD students, and it's not clinical. It's often looking at the relationship between psychedelic use and empathy, microdosing. It's cross-sectional research, which is a fancy word for doing surveys online.
Okay.
Because it is very difficult to do clinical research in Australia, but there's lots of people using psychedelics, and we can tap into that through mechanisms like Facebook, and there's a lot of organisations that are interested in the topic, so we can get surveys out there, and we've been collecting some really good data. I've got an honours student that's just submitted her dissertation looking at mystical states occasioned by psychedelics and pro-environmental behaviour, which is a really interesting study. And I've got a PhD student based in South Africa where ibogaine, a drug that's traditionally used by the Bwati people as part of their initiation ritual. It's kind of a psychedelic. It's not quite a psychedelic, but it's used in medicine there to treat addiction. And so she's looking at sort of mapping the state of consciousness that ibogaine occasions when people take it, and looking at the role of integration for when people come out of the clinic and reintegrate back into their new life. And then, as you mentioned, sort of clinical research. So it is really difficult to do clinical research in Australia. PRISM started in around 2011 and has been advocating and trying to get clinical research up since then. Its first successful trial that's started recruiting participants is at St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne, where they're looking at psilocybin as a treatment for people experiencing anxiety or depression after they've received a diagnosis of cancer. And so it's extending research that's already been done overseas at Johns Hopkins, New York University, and in the 60s before it all got shut down, which demonstrates that mystical state that's occasioned by psychedelic drugs can be really helpful in allowing a person to accept their situation. It improves their quality of life. They're able to talk to people close to them about what's happening for them. So when people have been asked about their family member who's gone through this experience, they've said that the connection, the social connection is a lot stronger. And so I often say it allows people to die with dignity, but it's more than that. It allows them to die with, and some of them don't end up dying actually, which is interesting, because obviously stress and the immune system are interrelated, but no one's gone as far as to say that there might be a link there.
Sure.
But maybe that's something for the future. So it allows people to to experience this state where they feel okay with the situation that they are currently in terms of the diagnosis and sort of that prognosis, which isn't particularly, which often isn't particularly good for them. So that was recruiting. I think they got up to 3 participants, and then COVID came and everything stopped. And as Melbourne went into lockdown and all of that, and it hasn't restarted again. I've been trying to get a trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder up. In fact, that was what PRISM had always been focused on. The psilocybin study at St Vincent's was just a happy bonus. So in 2012, we submitted to an ethics committee that rejected it because we were basically replicating the model MAPS was using in the US and trying to apply it to Australia. And they said, you can't do that. You need to have a university, a hospital. You need to have all these people involved if you want to do this in Australia. Then in 2016, we found somebody that had an affiliation or an adjunct position at Deakin University, And before it even hit the ethics committee, the deputy vice chancellor of research at Deakin, who's basically the head honcho of research, said, "Nah, not at our university." Then in 2017, I moved to ECU, or late 2017. In 2018, I emailed my deputy vice chancellor and just flicked a couple of papers, knowing that he had a background in medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And he emailed back saying, "Why aren't we doing this in Australia?" And I went,
Mm.
"Yes, this is the sort of response we want."
Yeah.
And it's just been a bit of a hard slog forward through from that point to, I mean, I've undergone the training with MAPS to do the MDMA assisted psychotherapy, and then it's just been, people have sometimes asked me, for people interested in doing clinical research, what's the one thing you'd tell them? And when I'm having a bad day, I tell them, you need to enjoy doing paperwork, because running clinical trials involves a shitload of paperwork,
Yeah.
electronic paperwork, and bureaucracy, and working with different government and institutional bodies and lawyers and all of those people. But we're progressing.
Why is it so hard? Like, why is it so hard to get clinical research done in Australia for things like this? Is it the decades and decades of prohibition culture and the propaganda that was spun from the 60s onwards, or
there's a lot of reasons. It's hard to sort of unpack them. So one is, as you mentioned, sort of the prohibition and propaganda. In addition to that, there's something that's called the pathological paradigm of drug research. Since that point in time, the government funds research that shows drugs are bad. And so if we're trying to fund research that show drugs could have therapeutic potential, it doesn't fit with that narrative. So funding is an issue because of that.
right?
I think there are more academics, particularly in the last 12 months, that are willing to put their head below the pulpit and say this is a good idea. We should be doing this. So in the past, academics were, particularly senior academics, weren't really putting their hand up to be part of this, where that's changing now in Australia.
Yeah.
And then the bureaucratic process is hampered by them just being illegal drugs. You've got to have a full-on security system and chain of custody to transport any small quantities of MDMA or psilocybin. And in turn, it sort of circles back to the issue of funding. It costs a lot of money then to do the research, because you're working with these illegal compounds.
Yeah. How much money are we talking for, say this trial that you want to do in Perth?
Well, the Perth trial is an exception. We're running it on a shoestring budget. ECU kicked in 10 grand in 2018 to move forward with the study as some seeding funding, which paid for myself and a co-therapist to do the training with MAPS, and it also paid for an ethics committee to review the protocol, the research protocol, which was expensive because we had to go to an independent ethics committee due to the nature of the research. And that pretty much expended my 10 grand. We're working in partnership with a hospital that's providing in-kind support. MAPS are providing the MDMA in-kind, so they're for free. That's a fancy word for free.
Yeah.
So, if we were paying for the MDMA, we'd possibly be paying between $2,000 and $5,000 for 3 grams of MDMA for good.
Really?
It's called GMP. Good manufacture process. It's a particular grade of MDMA, and there's not much of it around. The storage of it, we're looking into at the moment. Again, it's all about leveraging networks at the moment. So I'm hoping that I've secured a free storage of it with collaborating with another university who's got a Schedule 9 safe with some free space in it. And it's often a matter of I feel like my experience with this, it's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And it's been a huge learning process all the way from back in 2012 when we put that first protocol into the ethics committee, and it bounced back because they said, you need all these other bits and pieces in. It's that same ethics committee we submitted to and got ethics approval from this year.
Right.
Because we had all those things in place. We'd done all the learning in 10 years, and but still, I continue to sort of learn things as we move along in terms of issues arising that we didn't foresee, and then figuring out a way of problem solving, and then moving forward and finding the next issue to problem solve.
Yeah. It seems to me, in summary, it sort of like requires a lot of people with good intent sort of putting themselves in and their own maybe careers in sort of grey area or slight jeopardy because they're prepared to say, hey, we want to explore this because we feel it could be good for humanity. What do you think like needs to change about our cultural perceptions to change even, like it's just we're so rigid in this idea of what is the right thing, and funnily enough the thing that we're trying to change is what people most need.
I don't know the answer to that. I think one thing I've learned in the last few years is that Australian culture is particularly conservative. And so if you look at what's happening around the world, there is an incredible amount of research happening at the moment in the US, in Europe, the UK, North America, Canada. There is a lot of research happening everywhere else in the world, but not much in Australia. And I think the reason for the limitations in Australia is our conservative nature. And it was kind of pointed out to me. I did a podcast with the Third Wave a couple of years ago after attending a conference in Prague, and they said to me, I thought Australians were all pretty liberal, open-minded people. And I said, well, they're the ones you've met traveling. They're the ones that have gone out and explored the world. Actually, Australia is a very conservative country, and I think that's for us here in Australia, that's been a limitation, because if you look at what's happening overseas in other countries, just with drug policy reform as well. I mean, the US presidential election, there's been a range of additional states that are able to provide medical cannabis, recreational cannabis, decriminalize various drugs. Oregon's moved to allow people to grow magic mushrooms and use them in ceremony once they've done the specified training that's still to be defined. But, within 2 years in Oregon, you'll be able to access mushrooms in some sort of ceremonial or therapeutic context.
Yep.
Canada's got recreational cannabis. We're a long way behind the rest of the world, and I think it's because we're just a little conservative.
Do you think that a lot of that is starting to change though? Like the younger generations in Australia are far less conservative, more progressive, because there's been a greater weight on things like travel as a priority. And, you look at any sort of survey that comes out, I don't know the exact numbers, you can probably tell me, 70% of people have tried MDMA under the age of 30 or so. Like there's just huge amounts of people who have experimented and had experiences with these types of substances.
It's actually a lot lower than you'd think. Those numbers young people today, in fact, this might surprise you, young people today, aged under 20, have used less drugs in their lifetime than any other cohort since we've been measuring this.
Really?
They drink less than any other cohort since we've been measuring drinking behaviour. And meanwhile, use of cannabis among people 50, 60 and over is at the highest level ever, and so is drinking among that cohort.
Yeah, okay.
And so that stereotype, that a lot of young people do use drugs. Certainly, the rates of use are higher among younger people compared to other cohorts, but they're not at like 70%. It's actually
Sure.
It's actually, there's this downward trend that we've seen in the last 15, 20 years. So young people are actually using less drugs and alcohol and other drugs than ever.
Yeah, okay. I'm glad you corrected me there. I must have been quoting some random poll that I saw in the West Australian at some point.
I think the poll that you might have seen was about pill testing. So 70% of Australians support pill testing.
Yeah.
So I think, definitely there is evidence that that young people, and in just the community in general, I mean, I've done a lot of work on pill testing for the past 5-10 years, and there is a changing public perception, but I'd say the same with psychedelic drugs. I've done, interviews with shock jocks 5-10 years ago, and people calling in really understood the difference between psychedelic-assisted therapy and taking LSD at a festival and having a great time. They really understood that distinction, and they were very supportive of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So I feel like the community. I feel like another problem in Australia, and I don't know if this is a worldwide issue, but certainly in Australia, is that politicians are often out of sync with community attitudes. We saw that with, the plebiscite on gay marriage.
Yeah.
That we had 70% support, but we still had to go and have a vote because no member of federal parliament was willing to actually do what they're paid for and make a decision. And I guess on an optimistic note, I think that's been one of the really positive things of COVID is we've seen politicians all of a sudden have to make some decisions in a hurry. Whereas up until very recently, I felt like a lot of politicians haven't been really making decisions, or they just kind of toe the party line, and nobody wants to really challenge the party line, even when there's clear public support for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you feel that you personally are viewed, who has been someone who's been advocating for harm reduction with pill testing for a long time, and as you said, you've been involved in trying to get these clinical trials up and running for 10 years. How has that been for you personally?
I remember when I was first studying, it might have been my dad's 50th birthday, and I said to one of his friends, they said, well, what are you studying? And I explained what I was doing, and they said, oh, I've got a solution for drug problems, and it only costs 10 cents. It's called a bullet. And I thought, oh, geez, this is going to be a hard slog.
Yeah.
But, as I said, I've done a lot of work with shock jocks, so I don't mind putting myself on the line. There's some people now that I probably would decline an interview with because I have been screwed over a few times. But generally, even with the shock jocks, I'll often, with pill testing, for example, I've done a few pieces on 6PR in the last 12 to 18 months. And I've seen, one thing I've seen is that the two interviewers have often had a different position, so one could see some support and one less so, and then over time I could see their position changing as well. So yeah, I think that there'll obviously be people that would strongly disagree with the approach that I'm suggesting to take more broadly in terms of drug policy, which is an evidence-based approach, but that's because they're coming from a moralistic stance. Mm-hmm. And my way of often turning that around on someone is to point that out, that what they're arguing for actually isn't based on evidence, it's just based on ideology.
Yeah. And what you're talking about there is a decriminalisation approach? Is that what you advocate for?
Yeah, decriminalisation, potentially regulation of things like cannabis. Like we've seen, I see with cannabis, I feel like it's not a question of whether or not cannabis should be legalised. It's about which is the best model of legalisation, because I'd hate to see something like Colorado where it's, a really capitalistic model. It's kind of like the alcohol and tobacco industry, because it's really hard to crank up the regulation once you've already let the cat out of the bag. So it's better to start with something that's very heavily regulated. So an example of a heavy regulation is Uruguay, where you can only buy cannabis for recreational purposes over the counter at a pharmacy.
Sure. Yeah.
So there's different models. And so for me, it's not a question of, when should we do it? It's just how should we do it? What's the evidence say is the best model?
And I mean, there is so much evidence for cannabis and the different alkaloids in that plant that have so much benefit to humans' health and all those sorts of things, right? So, moving on to sort of the different psychedelics that, we know exist. And you mentioned Ibogaine previously. What are your views on the different psychedelics? Are there any you view as sort of not good or not safe or anything like that?
Well, probably just because you mentioned it, Ibogaine's one I'm a little circumspect of because it can be cardiotoxic. All of the classical psychedelics, be it mescaline through to psilocybin, LSD, ayahuasca, have all very good safety profiles in terms of both acute toxicity, so it's difficult to overdose. Mescaline it is possible to overdose on mescaline, but it takes quite a lot of mescaline.
Yeah.
But nobody's ever died from an LSD overdose. There's a recorded case in the scientific literature from the 70s where a couple of people in San Francisco, I think it was, they were having a party. They found a stash of white powder. They assumed it was cocaine. It was the 70s. It was LSD. They racked up some lines and took about 20,000 doses each of LSD. They ended up in hospital having a pretty difficult psychological time, but they didn't have any physiological issues, and they were discharged the next day with no... I don't know how they were psychologically, but physiologically they were fine. Whereas with other drugs, if that had been even MDMA, MDMA I wouldn't class as a psychedelic per se, but MDMA, there is potential for acute toxicity, and with regular heavy use, potential for chronic toxicity as well.
Sure. Yeah. Because Ibogaine, as you say, Ibogaine, right? Yeah. That was featured quite heavily in the documentary Dosed, which is where I first saw you. Actually, you were speaking after that at the Luna Cinema in Leaderville here, watching that documentary, it was really intense. Like for those people listening, the documentary followed a woman from Canada who was a heroin addict.
Dependent on heroin. Yeah,
dependent on heroin, some sort of opioid addiction. Tried using psilocybin to overcome that, sort of had mild, overcame that sort of in some way, but then kept relapsing, eventually went to a retreat where she did Ibogaine, and, it looked like she was just lucid for days and sort of like not even herself,
Yeah, it is. It's a long experience.
Yeah.
So in addition to LSD is a long experience, so times that by 3 or 4 and you've got an Ibogaine experience. And I guess there are some other newer psychedelic drugs that I guess that you'd still consider that they're classic psychedelics. So Alexander Shulgin developed hundreds of psychedelic compounds. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Shulgin's work, but he was a psychopharmacologist in the 60s. He was employed by, I think it was Dow Pharmaceuticals, developed a herbicide, and they basically said, he can do what he wants at work. And he said, I want to study psychedelics because he'd had some personal experience, and he wanted to understand why, psilocybin was slightly different in subjective effect to, say, mescaline or LSD based on its psychopharmacology. And so he started with mescaline and just kept tweaking this molecule, creating hundreds of new chemicals that he tested on himself in low doses. If they seemed like they weren't toxic, he'd up the dose. If they seemed like they were really interesting, he'd hold a little get-together and have a few psychiatrists and philosophers all sit around in a group, and they would take it together. And he wrote about this in a book called Phenethylamines I've Known and Loved,
right?
Which contained the recipes, dosage information, qualitative experiences. This was published in, I think, 1992. And some of those drugs are used in research at the moment. DOI, for example, DOI, is used as a tracer, a radioactive tracer, to sort of look at parts of the brain, but it's a very long-acting drug, and I've sort of looked after people at festivals that have taken large doses of DOB or DOM, these sorts of chemicals, and because they've got the dosing wrong, they're locked in for a really long time, like 48, 72 hours of full-on psychedelic experience.
Wow.
And so, yeah, I don't think there's any bad psychedelics per se. I think it's more about people thinking about what is the best chemical for them, for their intention and what they're planning on doing. And so it kind of makes sense, actually, to take, DOI at a festival that lasts for 3 days, but you probably want to get the dosing right. So harm reduction is important as well. Knowing information about the drug you're taking, knowing how to take it in a way that's least likely to cause harm. All of those things, once you put them together, means that I don't necessarily see any drug as good or bad. Any drug, even methamphetamine, it's a chemical. It's the way we interact with that chemical that causes harm, we as people.
Yeah. I imagine, there's a potential for people listening to any type of conversation like this, where they're like, oh, well, they should be illegal and people should just not use them. What do you say to that?
I have so many responses. I don't know where to start. Look, more hundreds of people die each year in Australia in motor vehicle accidents, mate, and it causes huge problems with the environment. We should ban cars, but we haven't. Instead, what we've done in terms of cars is we've tried to reduce the impact on the environment by changing the way that cars work. We put seatbelts in cars, airbags in cars. We've made roads safer. And so essentially that's what I'm, arguing for is harm reduction. That's harm reduction. And in fact, when they first put seatbelts in cars, there was concern in Australia that it was going to cause people to drive faster. And it seems crazy to think that people would believe that now, but that's what people are saying with things like drug checking, pill testing, that, if you have drug checking, then more people are going to use more drugs. And there's just not the evidence to support that.
Yeah.
I guess, I personally don't drink alcohol, but, if people enjoy drinking alcohol, sure, it's legal. Some people enjoy using other substances and they don't enjoy, alcohol, or they don't enjoy LSD, or they don't enjoy methane, whatever. I think allowing people to have cognitive liberty and, change their brain chemistry however they choose to as a personal choice is a value I hold strongly.
I was having this conversation yesterday on the last episode I recorded with my guest, Tim Guest, and we sort of started talking about this topic of self-responsibility and how, I actually feel like in society we have given up a lot of our self-responsibility and or allowed the government to take it away from us. And, there seems to be this kind of belief in this conversation with people that adults in Australia won't act responsibly if they are given the choice to make their own decisions about that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I think partly it becomes a reciprocating, cyclical problem, because if you don't give people responsibility, then they don't know how to handle responsibility. And I think one of the problems in Australia in terms of our drug use culture is it's based on our alcohol use culture. We don't have a great culture of alcohol use. People like to get drunk, to get pissed. People like to get messed up. And people then try to apply that to their use of other drugs, be it MDMA or Psilocybin, and all of a sudden find themselves in a really difficult position because that's kind of the culture we have. Whereas if you look at other cultures, without even going to places like South America where it's, built into, ayahuasca sort of built into their culture and their cosmology, even if you look at different parts of Europe and the way in which, intoxication is frowned upon, the culture is very different. We have a very... And our culture, our drug culture in Australia really started very early on in terms of colonisation. There is evidence of some use of psychoactive substances among Indigenous Australians, though I think a lot of it hasn't been documented because of biopiracy, really. The concern that, there's been a lot that has been stolen from Indigenous people, and so I wouldn't I'm not going to sort of go into any detail into that. But in terms of the colonisation, very early on in the Australian culture, they basically, the colony in Sydney at Botany Bay ran out of food. A ship was coming past that had food. They wouldn't sell the food without selling all the rum that was on board as well. And rum basically became a currency in early Australian Sydney.
Right.
To the point where the police at the time became known as the Rum Corps. They were going around trying to prevent people distilling their own rum because it had become the currency of the colony. So our whole culture is built around, we were founded on, the use of alcohol and binge drinking basically has been part of our culture since Western civilization, since Western colonization of Australia.
Yeah. You mentioned, some of the native Aboriginal culture and there is sort of some evidence of them using psychoactive plants. And I assume you didn't touch on that too much. What you're alluding to sounds like is that they've kind of kept that secret and sacred. They haven't really shared that openly because of how much has been taken from them.
Exactly. And there is some, there's some that's in the public domain already. So things like patchouli. So there's there's a native Australian plant that produces a nicotine-like compound, and it was traded throughout. There's evidence that it was traded throughout Australia for its stimulant properties, appetite suppressant, could help, in terms of hunting, foraging, all of those sorts of things. But there's a lot more, I think, that we don't know about that's been kept secret for good reason.
I mean, an obvious one is the wattle tree and certain types of wattle, which is how DMT is extracted, the plant that DMT is extracted from. And I've heard stories that, they used to sort of wave a flaming smoking wattle bush over, women having babies and stuff like that. I'm sure you've heard sort of similar stories to that, right?
Yeah. And I've tried to respect, I guess, I have heard stories of it. It's often come from other Caucasian people rather than Indigenous people. And so,
True.
I kind of have not tried to explore it too much for respect of that. And, even there's the Christmas tree in Western Australia is quite a prolific tree. If you're driving south or north from Perth, you see, particularly at the moment, they're all flowering. I've got a colleague who is an ethnobotanist, and he came over to Western Australia, took a sample and wanted to get it analysed because it was suspected that it might contain some psychoactive compounds. And when he took it to the university, he said the university told him, we can't analyse this because, one, you haven't got permission to have taken it from where you've gotten it from, and two, you need to work with the community you need to ask them if they want it analysed. We can't just analyse this and find out what's in it.
Right.
You need to ask the community, because if we find something, that could change medical science or something like that, then you need to ask the traditional owners. They need to have some sort of ownership of the results that we find.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I haven't thought about that. Sort of talking about traditions, a lot of the traditions around psychedelics are based in ancient culture, and there's a lot of historical literature which points to ceremonies, Greek history, and you mentioned South America, and they were revered as medicines, and these powerful mystical experiences that they had, and in often in cases connection to God, as they would call it, or a goddess. Why do you think that as a modern society we do not seem to value mystical experiences?
I think we've forgotten our own history. What I find really interesting is with sort of this psychedelic renaissance and renewed interest that people are focusing on, those indigenous South American cultures, North American use of peyote, and Mexican, indigenous Mexican use of psilocybin mushrooms. Sort of looking over there. If we look at our own history and paganism, plants like datura, henbane, mandrake, these are all psychoactive plants that have very powerful psychoactive properties. I wouldn't recommend anybody use them because they're also quite dangerous. They can cause overdose. These were all being used by our culture, 600, 700, 800 years ago. It's like that's all been repressed, and potentially, even our own religions our own religions. I'm not religious, but I say our, but the popular religions around Christianity, Judaism, Islam have all potentially come from those mystical experiences from psychoactive drugs as well. But it's like we've forgotten. We've either forgotten or we've repressed it. We've purposely forgotten about that information and that tradition for some reason.
Yeah. Do you think that because this topic is one that I hold quite close to my heart based on my own personal experiences with psychedelics. We're talking about clinical trials and legalization so that people can have access to this sort of medicine to help them overcome trauma and all those sorts of things. I just went and did it all by myself, with a guide, with a friend, whatever, in other countries and, in Australia as well. But it has been those mystical experiences that have, for me at least, changed my experience of life, beyond just, I overcame that period of depression specifically by taking this psychedelic drug. It's so much more than that. And so the conversation right now being purely focused on the therapeutic benefits, when do you think it will ever move beyond that? Do you think we need to conquer that first and then move to the next part of it?
Well, even within the clinical trials with psilocybin and, primarily psilocybin, there's also been some recent clinical trials using LSD. They have been measuring mystical states, and mystical states are strongly associated with the outcome. So as you say, it's not just take this will fix the problem. It's the experience. And then you've got a whole bunch of other researchers that are trying to make these drugs non-psychoactive to see if we can create a bunch of antidepressants and anxiolytics that don't have psycho. I don't think that's going to work because in my personal opinion, it is the mystical experience that's, it's ineffable. It's difficult to describe what it is and why it's so important and how it is therapeutic. The oceanic boundlessness. So it's been well described. It's been researched. So Rick Doblin's PhD looked at a famous experiment called the Good Friday experiment. I don't know if you've come across this. It was actually when Timothy Leary was doing research. I think he oversaw the study. He wasn't that involved in this particular study. What a PhD student did was they set up a randomized control trial with theologians, people studying theology at Harvard. And on Good Friday, they did a randomized control trial where the theologian students they're either in the basement or upstairs somewhere, and half got basically like a nicotine or vitamin B as the placebo, and the other group got the psilocybin. And Rick followed them up 20, 30 years on, and they still said it was the most significant experience, in terms of what they've done in their life. The people that got the psilocybin said it was the most significant thing that's impacted them spiritually, but also as being one of the most meaningful experiences of their life. So it's really shaped their life 20, 30 years later still.
So I suppose to continue on from that then is, how do we get to a point where it is okay for these substances to be used for me or for you or any other adult being to use them to explore their own human consciousness, to explore their own potential, not to have to be diagnosed and say, I have depression, I need this to treat this.
I think it's a long way off.
Yeah.
I think in a utopian world, absolutely, I agree with it. That model just makes sense in a utopian world, but we don't live in that world. We live in a world where I think that, if we look at different institutions that have a vested interest in not allowing this, so you talked about clinical trials, that the medical institution of medicine is not going to easily give up their control over these drugs once they become medicines. I mean, they're not even medicines yet. There's people researching them. Once they become medicines, and we've seen that with medical cannabis in Australia, the AMA have been, have tried to keep control over who can and can't prescribe medical cannabis. Then other institutions, such as churches, why go to the priest to communicate to God when you can, take a couple of 100 mics of LSD and dial a direct line? I think I'm plagiarizing Huxley or another philosopher from the 50s, but that there is, there are a range of institutions that have a vested interest in not allowing that to happen. So even though we seem to be living in this wellness culture in which that would be part of understanding, it's the holistic wellness, there are a lot of barriers for us to be able to be in a society where that's not only okay and not stigmatized, but permitted and sanctioned.
Mm. What would require what would be required to overcome those institutions? Is it like, politicians standing up to that? Is it, who has the control ultimately?
You ask some very hard questions.
I'm just curious to know the answer.
I kind of did my PhD on this, and it's the looking at the way in which institutions control the narrative around drugs.
Yeah.
And the institutions have a self-serving interest in maintaining power, and so they're not going to let go of power. So I don't know what the simple answer is, because there isn't one. There isn't a simple answer. Politicians are politics is an institution of itself. They want power. Everybody in society, our society, struggles to maintain the status quo because the status quo maintains their power relationship over other people in society. And so it's going to take, it's some sort of paradigm change to break away from the current situation in which we have all these institutions that are trying to fight hand over cuff to be in control of what's happening in the country and in the world.
I mean, that sort of leads to an interesting conversation because, I've always joked with friends. It's like the people who are most opposed to psychedelics are the ones that need it the most. The institutions grappling for power need it the most to realize that they don't need to have the power in that way. But that almost, if we were to future project, does kind of lead us to a situation where what would the whole world look like if legalization on everything was around and everyone could freely take psychedelics, and everyone was able to access those mystical experiences and have that profound sort of experience and connection with themselves and other people. What would the world look like, do you think?
Well, for one, if you look at all the religions, one of the main tenets is the golden rule, do unto others. And if you've had a mystical experience, then you do unto others because we are all one. And so we're talking about the sort of oceanic boundlessness, being interconnected. So, you would think on one hand it would lead to a healthier society. However, the skepticist in me says that they've also seen, taking psychedelics. Psychedelics aren't a panacea. The Manson family took psychedelics, and it didn't do them a lot of good. In fact, it just created a cult in which they committed atrocities, and there are a number of examples like that. There's the family in Melbourne was another cult in which they stole children and inducted them into the cult. So these drugs, again, the drug is neutral. It can be used for good or bad. It really depends on set and setting. So the environment the person's using it in, but also the person's set. Because something I've observed over the last 10 years where I've been really interested in this area is there's a subset of people that become interested in the not just the topic of psychedelics, but the experience of psychedelics. And part of the mystical experience is ego dissolution, but I see a very small proportion of people where it almost consolidates their ego and they walk away from the experience going, I know the answer now. Yeah. And then they try to tell everybody what the answer is, but you won't understand the answer. You need to drink higher, or you need to take this, or whatever it is that they're using, and yet they keep going back for more. They keep going back to that experience, almost even though there's not really any physiological dependence, but there's almost a psychological dependence where they keep going back to it, and they're really sort of stuck in this idea that they're going to change the world by continuing to drink ayahuasca or take mushrooms or whatever it is. And so, as a contemporary example, I don't know if you gave Donald Trump psychedelics, whether it would make him a better person. It may actually make him a nastier person.
Yeah. Because, I understand that. But I still kind of have this belief that on the whole, we are living in a society where the majority of people have good intent and, don't want to do harm to other people. So if the majority of society had access to it, maybe we would have a maybe we'd have a more polarized or more extreme uh, society.
Yeah, it could do all kinds of. You could do thought experiments. It could create all kinds of strange situations like that, where
Yeah.
you could end up with this weird, society where it's the mushroom people versus the ayahuasca people because they all know different truths. Yeah, I mean, there's so many interesting thought experiments you can do with this, but essentially. Yeah, I don't think it's. I think I did just go back to the point that it's the chemical, whether it's a psychedelic or any chemical, is never the panacea. It's you said intention. People have to have good intention. It needs to happen within a supportive environment with supportive people around, or even if the person's on their own. But the environment needs to be supportive for the person to be able to have not only a mystical experience, but something that's positive. Because there are people that have very strong mystical experiences, like this subgroup I mentioned before, and they've kind of realized that all the answers to the world, but they've got a family, a wife, 3 kids. They're not able to sort of look after their family because they're so busy drinking ayahuasca. So,
Yeah.
yeah, there's definitely caveats to psychedelics and them not necessarily being any sort of panacea to our world's problems.
Yeah. You sort of have to, it's kind of like that Zen Buddhism. What do you do before enlightenment? Chop wood. What do you do after enlightenment? Chop wood. Whether or not people subscribe to that or not. And
Yeah, and I think people that get the most benefit from psychedelics do a lot of work and preparation and integration, and so it's not the experience in and of itself, it's the experience in the context of the discipline and preparation and intention and integration that all comes together to lead to positive personal growth. It's not, if you just give someone a psychedelic, they're not necessarily going to have positive growth. So I've seen that, providing harm reduction services at festivals, essentially trip sitting people that have found themselves in a difficult position because their intention was to go to a festival and have some fun, and all of a sudden it's brought something up, or they're having a spiritual emergence, or something is happening, and they're finding it really difficult to manage that. There was something else that you said in there as well with the, like the enlightenment. What do you do before enlightenment? Chop wood. What do you do after enlightenment? Chop wood. That resonated with me. I'm just trying to think what it was.
That's okay.
It'll come.
Yeah,
back.
yeah. What's like I've heard anecdotally a lot of people sharing their experiences, and you hear these kind of experiences of people on psychedelics. They're like, I could I was tapping into the quantum field and I was able to move things with my mind and stuff like that, or just it's like sort of really crazy. Well, it would sound like crazy things. Is there any this is quite a funny question. Is there any research? I don't even know why I'm asking this. Are you doing any research, or is there any research, or has there been any research done on anything like that? That would
the paranormal, I think, is what you kind of
paranormal
to,
or like those extreme sort of spiritual experiences.
I'm not aware of any research that's confirmed anyone's experience.
I don't know what benefit we would have from it. But.
And I've spoken to lots of people that have had shared experiences where it's been quite crazy stuff, and it's not really explainable through traditional physics, but other than their anecdote, there hasn't been, as far as I'm aware, of any research done into that.
Yeah,
I think what I was thinking before was, in terms of the chop wood before, chop wood after, is something that's happened in the past, and this is ramping up, is there is really this interest in psychedelics at the moment that's really ramping up. I think Michael Pollan's book contributed to that in a positive way, but as people have become more and more interested in this field, and more people are getting interested in it, That's why I keep saying psychedelics are not a panacea, because people get over enthusiastic about it. And as somebody that was as sort of an observer of what was happening with medical cannabis in Australia 10 years ago, I kind of can see I'm in the middle of it now, where instead of observing it, being in a similar sort of situation where people see it as a potential panacea. People want to get into, become a psychedelic therapist without really thinking through what that involves, and will be a facilitator of well-being centers and things like that. There's just so much enthusiasm at the moment. I think what I would like to do is just temper that enthusiasm just a little bit by saying that this isn't a panacea, that it can create very challenging experiences for people,
Yeah.
that are wanting to go out and try it, and to make sure people have done their research.
Yeah.
And, if you want to be a psychedelic therapist, you need to be prepared to be able to sit with someone for 8-10 hours and, sit with them through that experience. For me, the most eye-opening part of it's not even my training, but my experience, was doing the harm reduction work at festivals and sitting with people for 6 hours. We're doing 6-hour shifts at a 4 or 5 day festival, and then you'd hand them over to someone else. And for me, it was humbling, because I went in there with quite a big ego. I'm a clinically trained psychologist. I know all about psychedelics. And the first person I looked after, a rover had brought him in. They'd found him face down in the dirt, eating dirt. And so I was cleaned him up. Eventually, his friends found him in the trip sitting sort of chill area, and confirmed that he'd just taken LSD. So it was physiologically he was fine. But when he presented, he could say one word, and that was love. His facial expressions, you could see these waves of emotion. I couldn't tell whether it was ecstasy or pure agony, because he couldn't communicate. And I realized at some point during that experience that all of that knowledge that I had was meaningless. All I needed to do for the next 6 hours was just be present with this person and just hold space with that person for that period of time, I actually had to hand him over, unfortunately, to somebody else who, as he was just starting to come out of it. But it really taught me that, I just see so many people so enthusiastic at the moment that want to take psychedelics, be psychedelic therapists, and I really encourage people that are looking at that to just go into the real world and look for experiences like that are out there, to experience and see where things go pear-shaped. Doing the MAPS training was incredible. Seeing MDMA basically looking much more like a psychedelic experience, where people with complex trauma were experiencing a transference process where they thought Michael Mithofer, the male psychotherapist, was their father who'd sexually abused them, and was, telling them basically, some very strong words were said to Michael. I've never seen anything like that in any of my clinical practice. And even I've seen some weird stuff, trip-sitting people, but that, again, took it to another level. And it just made me really reflect on how challenging the work can be, whether that's as a psychedelic psychotherapist or as somebody that wants to, sort of facilitate wellness ceremonies and things like that. Things can get really full on, and I think the enthusiasm needs to be tempered with some of that real life exposure, so that people might just slow down a little bit and go, oh, not sure if I do want to take psychedelics now, or maybe I need to do some more research before I do this, or maybe I need to start at a lower dose, or whatever it is. But just slow everything down a little bit, because none of it's going away.
Yeah.
It's all still going to be there tomorrow. So yeah, a lot of the, when I speak to people like yourself, a lot of, I guess, my key message that I'm trying to sort of weave into it is just, everybody, let's just slow down a little bit, and let's just calm down and be aware of the potential implications of this. Like, you're asking that question: what if we just what if tomorrow everything was legalized and everybody could access these drugs? It could lead to all kinds of weird and strange worlds. I'm not sure that our current society is actually ready for that.
Yeah. And perhaps, if it was legalized and we're not ready for it, society wouldn't, most people would keep doing what they're doing now. And some people would be like, no, I'm not going to take it. And
well, I mean, if you look at why psychedelics were banned, it was because, basically we could end up with a similar situation where we legalize it and then we have to ban it again because of concern about all of those institutions that I talked about. Essentially, that's what shut it down. It was the institutions were concerned, be them churches, politicians. They thought that psychedelics were going to lead to the dissolution of society as we know it. And so if tomorrow everything were legalized, I think we would probably go down a similar path because we haven't kind of gotten off that path yet.
Yeah.
That's still happening now. That's what's preventing it from happening. So if it were legalized, then I think it would all be put back into a box after there was some crazy media reporting about, some like there was in the 60s, about the one person, the 1 in 1 million person that had a particularly negative experience.
Yeah.
And we saw that in the Netherlands most recently. So as people might know, in the Netherlands, up until 5-10 years ago, you could buy psilocybin mushrooms. You can still get truffles there because it's a loophole. The reason psilocybin mushrooms were banned and why you can only get the truffles now in the Netherlands was because of a famous case where I think it was a British teenager that was, his father was well-to-do, possibly an MP, I don't know, I think he might have fallen out of a balcony or something tragic happened. He died, and then all of a sudden, what do? When something bad happens, we ban it. That's kind of our response at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you on that, and I think it's a really interesting point of view. I think almost kind of relating it back to my own experiences, there's a lot that I would say I wouldn't recommend doing that, to people. Like, yeah, I know I went and did that and I was just over in Hawaii by myself, traipsing through a jungle effectively with barefoot on mushrooms, and I had some crazy experiences. It got really hard, managed to deal with it and process whatever came up. But it's like, I wouldn't recommend you doing that, because it's not everyone would come out of those kind of experiences on top. And there's many situations that in the past I've put myself into where, where things could have gone wrong.
And I have seen patients where they have had PTSD as a result of a bad psychedelic experience.
Yeah.
So it definitely can go wrong, and people can have long-term harm. And we talk about all of these there's so many positive psychedelic stories at the moment in the media because of the clinical research and everything that's going on, but there are still, and my concern is that as we continue with that narrative and we continue talking about the medicalization of it and people become increasingly aware that these are potentially therapeutic, desperate people will do desperate things. And so if I have chronic depression or complex PTSD, it's not responding to a treatment, then I'm going to be more likely to try to go out and find these compounds in an illicit environment. Even if we were able to in Australia to, the TGA is currently considering rescheduling psilocybin and MDMA. I doubt they're going to decide to reschedule it as a medicine. We'd be the first country in the world to do it. Australia is usually not the first country in the world to do that sort of thing with drugs.
Yeah.
But even if they were, for most people, it wouldn't make that any difference because we're not talking about mushrooms. We're talking about synthetic psilocybin and synthetic MDMA, which has to be produced in to a very high standard. And if we look at medical cannabis in Australia, it's extremely expensive. It's getting more easy to access, but it's very expensive, and it's because of those stringent manufacturing requirements. So it's crazy in Australia at the moment. We have all these companies growing medical cannabis that are exporting it. almost all, other than one company I'm aware of that is growing and selling in Australia, we're importing it all. And the reason it's so expensive, it's like the illicit drug market, except basically it's being, it's changing hands so many times and everybody puts their markup on it. Unlike illicit drugs, it's not necessarily being cut or anything like that, but it's essentially changing hands. If you try and apply that then to MDMA-assisted psychotherapy or psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, you're adding in the costs of psychiatrists and psychologists. So it would absolutely, I did some back of the envelope sort of maths. I worked out that it would cost about $20,000 per person to be able to access MDMA-assisted psychotherapy should it become a medicine tomorrow.
Wow.
So what you end up with is a similar situation with medical cannabis, where the most recent data shows, in the last 12 months, in 2019, in that 12-month period, just over 1 in 10 Australians smoked pot. Of that 1 in 10 that smoked pot, 6.7% only used it for medical reasons. Of that 6.7%, 1 in 100 had a script.
Yeah.
The other 99 in 100 didn't.
Yeah.
And so I worry that as we continue this narrative, because I've kind of seen what's happened with medical cannabis, the difficulties people have had accessing it, people being prosecuted for growing their own and then, to try to, manufacture their own oil and being done for manufacture of drugs. I just worry that as we continue down this narrative that it's going to, maybe at the end point in 20 years from now, we will see the benefits. But in the short term, we may see more problems along the way.
Yeah. What is the difference between, if any difference, between, naturally occurring psilocybin and synthetic psilocybin?
Absolutely none.
Nothing.
No.
Yeah, right. Because I know there's, this kind of this, you hear the word synthetic and you go, oh, that can't be good, or
It's called the appeal to nature logical fallacy. That synthetic is bad and natural is good.
Yeah.
Because there is plenty of natural things that are really bad, like asbestos.
Yep.
Cyanide. There's plenty of natural things. So the idea that something synthetic is somehow less good than something that is natural is a logical fallacy. There's no evidence for that. There's plenty of synthetic things that are extremely safe and don't cause, problems to the environment. And then there are other synthetic things like natural things that are toxic to us and toxic to the environment.
Sure. Do they, to create synthetic psilocybin, is it some sort of extraction process?
No,
or it's actually just manufactured.
Just pure synthesis. Yeah.
Wow.
It's cheap. It's easier and cheaper to synthesize psilocybin than it is to actually extract it from the mushrooms themselves.
Yeah, of course. Fascinating. There you go. Well, I think we've covered a lot. Was there anything else you wanted to add to that conversation before we wrap it up?
No, I think somehow we managed to navigate through probably the key messages I had in my mind coming here, which was around just tempering people's enthusiasm a little bit with all of the hype around psychedelics and people wanting to become psychedelic therapists and being aware of. You said most people have good intentions. There are people out there that don't have good intentions, and they're looking to leverage this as an opportunity to make money, to rip people off. So people just need to be, I think, cautious, smart, just slow things down a little bit, look into things. I think that was probably a key message that I had. And the other one was sort of what we finished on, which was, with all of this interest, like with medical cannabis, where's it going, and is it a good place that we're going to get to, and how are we going to sort of navigate that journey?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been really, really interesting conversation, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.